We are talking today with Andrew Gumbel. Andrew Gumbel is a professional journalist with over 18 years' experience. He has been a foreign correspondent for Reuters, The Guardian, and The London Independent. He is also a contributor to the Los Angeles Times, the LA Weekly, and LA City Beat. And he is here to talk about his book, Steal This Vote: Dirty Elections and the Rotten History of Democracy in America. If you would begin and tell us what was the motivation in writing Steal This Vote?
Well, for one reason or another, more by accident than design, I've been following democratic movements for a lot of my professional career. I was in Berlin after the wall came down, which was a colossal piece of luck. I was in Yugoslavia in the mid-90s when there were massive street demonstrations against Slobodan Milosevic, clamoring for his removal, which eventually happened. And then when I arrived in the States, I found the whole prospect of what goes on in the world's most powerful democracy to be absolutely beguiling. I arrived in the middle of the Clinton impeachment saga, which as an exercise in democracy struck me as being pretty dysfunctional, whatever you thought of the merits one way or the other. And then I was in Austin on election night in 2000, which is the weirdest political night of my life, with Florida in the Gore column, out of the Gore column, results announced, retracted, people left standing in the rain on Congress Avenue in Austin, and it was really just quite extraordinary. And then since then, my interest...
We are talking today with Andrew Gumbel. Andrew Gumbel is a professional journalist with over 18 years' experience. He has been a foreign correspondent for Reuters, The Guardian, and The London Independent. He is also a contributor to the Los Angeles Times, the LA Weekly, and LA City Beat. And he is here to talk about his book, Steal This Vote: Dirty Elections and the Rotten History of Democracy in America. If you would begin and tell us what was the motivation in writing Steal This Vote?
Well, for one reason or another, more by accident than design, I've been following democratic movements for a lot of my professional career. I was in Berlin after the wall came down, which was a colossal piece of luck. I was in Yugoslavia in the mid-90s when there were massive street demonstrations against Slobodan Milosevic, clamoring for his removal, which eventually happened. And then when I arrived in the States, I found the whole prospect of what goes on in the world's most powerful democracy to be absolutely beguiling. I arrived in the middle of the Clinton impeachment saga, which as an exercise in democracy struck me as being pretty dysfunctional, whatever you thought of the merits one way or the other. And then I was in Austin on election night in 2000, which is the weirdest political night of my life, with Florida in the Gore column, out of the Gore column, results announced, retracted, people left standing in the rain on Congress Avenue in Austin, and it was really just quite extraordinary. And then since then, my interest has followed very much the public debate, which is when the new generation of computer touchscreen voting machines came in. I started to hear that professional computer scientists were looking at these things and finding them to be riddled with errors. There was the state of emergency declared in Florida again in 2002 when those machines were first deployed there. And I started to think, first of all, that this is more than just a curious set of circumstances. This is actually a profound scandal, that these machines are so prone to error and to malicious intervention, possibly, that needed further investigation. I'm not a computer scientist. I'm not a tech nerd. And I thought, what can I do to expand this investigation further? And it dawned on me that people were saying, isn't it strange that we have all these problems with our elections in this great democracy that's always worked so well? And I thought to myself, there's something wrong with that premise. And so I thought the way to go is to dig into the history and to try and make sense of what's going on now by looking at not only precedents for irregularities in elections, but also the whole architecture of how American democracy grew up and what its flaws were right from the start, really, and how they grew into what we have now. And just to try and establish some continuity so that people could make sense of the things that, given the high ideals that many people in this country laudably have about their democracy, and given the complete disparity between what they believe and what they have been seeing in the last few years, I thought it was very important to say, this is how to account for that disparity in a way that is methodical and makes sense from a historical point of view.
All right, maybe you can give us some of that history that we all seem to be missing here in the U.S. When did it really begin in terms of fraudulent voting?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of issues. Fraudulent voting is part of it, but then, betrayal of the democratic interest more broadly is almost the background to it. And that really began at the beginning with the drawing up of the Constitution. A lot of people, and really the key problem at the beginning was race. I mean, it's terrible to reduce it to one word, but it's really the best way to explain it. everybody knows that, in the Constitution there wasn't a repudiation of slavery. What I think is less clear to people is how slavery became hardwired into the institutions of American democracy. The way congressional districts were carved up according to the weighting of the population was done with slavery very much in mind, that the southern states negotiated that for the purposes of weighting their congressional districts, would count as 3/5 of a person. That was known as the federal ratio, but of course when it came to actual voting, they counted as 0/5 of a person. That in turn then had a knock-on effect on the Electoral College, which is based largely on the way congressional districts work. And if you look at the first 50 years of the country, you see that the presidency and the vice presidency was, lopsidedly held by Southerners, especially Virginians. And that was because of the influence of slavery, and they were apologists for slavery, and that's why slavery persisted for such a long time, and you can even argue it was one of the contributing causes to the Civil War. So that's, at the beginning. Later on, with the formation of political parties, you had an extraordinary set of circumstances in this country that, on the one hand, it was the first country in the world to significantly expand voting rights in the 30s and 40s under Andrew Jackson first, and then carrying on as the cities expanded and a kind of retail politics grew up, that people were intimately involved in their ward affairs. Their ward bosses then, in turn, were intimately involved in the management of the city. All of that was absolutely unprecedented. And the paradox was that in European countries, you had industrialization that came along first, and then suffrage rights came along later, essentially because the industrial working class found their conditions absolutely intolerable, threatened outright insurrection, and then in order to ward off that insurrection, they slowly gained both voting rights and also labor rights and workplace benefit rights and so on and so forth, and those things came together. In the United States, the industrialization came after the expansion of voting rights. Obviously, it wasn't expanded to everybody, but a significant expansion to most white men, certainly. And then the captains of industry who wanted to expand their wealth and the politicians who subscribed to the idea that capitalism should be allowed to carry on more or less unfettered, felt very threatened by the existence of voting rights and actually set about dismantling an awful lot of the suffrage rights that had been gained in the previous 50 years. And you see in the late 19th century a whole host of techniques for doing that, between the disenfranchisement of blacks in the South, which is a relatively well-known phenomenon, but also the disenfranchisement really of the entire working class through education tests, good character tests. Funnily enough, when they brought in the secret ballot, as opposed to what had happened before, which was party-controlled ballots, in many places they made those ballots very difficult to use, very difficult to read. They removed party symbols, they removed party names. Sometimes they put the names in absolutely random order. So if you didn't know ahead of time who you were voting for, it was very hard to vote. All of this had the effect of really halving the number of people who regularly turned out for elections in this country from about 80%, which is where it had been, up to the 1880s, and down into the 40s. And it's never really recovered from that. And if you look today, you see that the United States is absolutely exceptional, not in the fact that it has low turnout rates because other countries suffer from the same problem, but in the fact that there's an almost exact correlation between who votes and their socioeconomic status. It's basically the richest half of the United States that goes to the polls and the poorer half that stays away. And that's a legacy of the history. And it was engineered very much by the two parties. That's the other thing that makes the United States more extreme than other places. Obviously, there are two-party dominant systems in other places too. But because of that period of disenfranchisement, the parties built up their own fiefdoms. And in the late 19th century and early 20th century, those fiefdoms were almost entirely separate. The Republicans dominated in Congress, they dominated in the North, and for most of the first 30 years of the 20th century, they dominated the White House, Woodrow Wilson being the only Democrat who got a look in. The Democrats, meanwhile, held the South. They were basically running dictatorships in the 11 former states of the Confederacy, with no challenge, seriously, from anybody else. So as the system became more mixed, with the dismantlement of Jim Crow laws, the civil rights movement, and so on and so forth, that mentality of having party fiefdoms and an absolute lack of interest in expanding the franchise beyond that, or in the sense that there was a party interest in getting as many people as possible involved in the process, which after all is the bedrock of the whole idea of representative democracy. That was, abhorrent to the parties. They don't talk about it publicly. Publicly, they all adhere to the sort of civic religion of democracy and talk about government of the people, by the people, for the people. But in reality, neither party is seriously interested in getting the electorate out in large numbers, and they're not interested in having a transparent process at election time. Whether that is because They don't want anybody looking too closely at how shoddily they've constructed the system, or whether in certain very tight circumstances when the opportunity for mischief arises, because they don't want to have fraudulent or dubious activities exposed. So you have this extraordinary situation in this country where the mechanism of democracy, certainly before 2000 and still to a large extent now, is almost completely hidden from the people it's designed to serve, that is to say the voters. And that's something that activists are now trying to change. And one thing, my book, among many, many other efforts, is attempting to cast light on what has been a very surprisingly dark place for a very long time.
So it sounds like the two parties are then working together on this effort. If you look at the current situation, a lot of people are saying that it's the Republicans that are really running things, both, from Washington, D.C., but in terms of voting. But it sounds like they're both pretty happy with the way things are going.
I wouldn't say they've worked together. I think the best way to explain it is the way that a political scientist and reformer called Joseph P. Harris described it in a study of election practices that he wrote in 1930, but it's still incredibly valid today, when he said you've really got to look at the two parties as rival gangs of thieves. And, like thieves, they're apt to make bargains with each other. And the integrity of the system, such as it is premised on the idea that the two parties will monitor one another and act as policemen, and that's going to save the system for everybody else. Not only do they make bargains, but they have an awful lot of interests in common. And that was true for a long time, to the point where if there were fraudulent elections, one very good example being the presidential election of 1960, where the votes for John Kennedy in Chicago were extremely suspicious, and almost certainly won him the state unfairly. If you look at the reaction, Richard Nixon, his Republican opponent, made the decision that he wasn't going to challenge the result. And I think part of that was because he wasn't sure he would come out the winner. But I think there was also a big cultural imperative in American politics that says you don't call out the other party for their dubious practices, because the only thing that can possibly happen is they're going to come back and air your dirty laundry in public too, and everybody ends up the loser. So there's been a kind of, you can almost call it a conspiracy of silence, which sounds rather sinister, but there's been a kind of gentleman's agreement between the parties. They're not going to talk about this. We're going to fight like dogs to get across that finish line and have somebody declared the winner. But once it's over, we're going to shut up and move on to the next race. Now, in 2000, that balance began to change because of the fight in Florida, where suddenly all bets were off. And you can argue, as I do in the book, that there was something particularly ferocious about the way in which the modern Republican Party has made its grab for more and more power. But it's a mistake to conclude because of that somehow the Democrats are the virtuous ones and the Republicans are the villains. I've talked to an awful lot of people around the country since writing this book, and my experience is that once you get away from the partisan talking points, if you talk to rank and file voters, ordinary people, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, and you explain to them that, the machines are unaccountable, they don't work very well, they're prone to fraud and error, the officials don't demonstrate the kind of openness you'd expect when dealing with the mechanics of representative democracy. All these other problems, conflicts of interest, money being misspent, all the rest of it. You find that basically 80, 90, maybe even 95%, I don't know, I can't put a figure on it, but the vast majority of people are on board on this. They want a fair democratic system. They're fine, they want their party to win, but they also want it to be a reasonably fair fight, and it very often is not. This is actually represents both a cause of scandal that people are beginning to realize this, but the very fact that it's now coming out in the open, it also represents an opportunity that for the first time really in American history, a large number of people, it's not enough people yet, but a large and growing number of people is aware that the system is not what it claims to be. And that, in turn, to the extent that it generates public debate, to the extent that it generates official reports from the likes of Jimmy Carter, James Baker, who formed a commission recently and made some very pointed criticism of the system. You've had the investigative arm of Congress, the GAO, investigating voting machines. All these things have come about in the last couple of years. It really represents an opportunity to expose the system for what it is and to try and put it right, finally. Basically 130 years after most other established democracies cleaned up their act.
And is it true that most of this is being engineered in a top-down method when we talk about, let's say, local elections being thrown one way or another? Does that come down from the two parties at the very top?
Well, one of the things about the United States is that it has an incredibly devolved political system, and nowhere is there a better example of that than the management of elections, that you don't have You certainly don't have a federal central authority. Most countries have a central electoral commission that decide how elections are held, approve standards for machines if there are machines, approve standards for practices for registering people, and so on and so forth. In the United States, that doesn't exist. Elections are basically administered on the local level, usually the county level, which means instead of having one election authority, you have more than 4,000. They all do things differently. They all have their own standards. They all make their own decisions about what machines they're going to purchase. There is a system for certifying those machines, but it's not subject to proper public oversight. There's a volunteer body, which is a private foundation based in Texas called the Election Center, which takes it upon itself to oversee the certification process on behalf of state election directors. But they have financial relationships with the voting machine manufacturers. The voting machine manufacturers, in turn, look to the supposedly independent testing labs on a commercial basis to see who's going to be testing their machines, and they pay them good money to do so. So that's not an entirely clean part of the process. Congress has nothing to do with any of it. And it's been shown time and again that machines that have been approved for certification and even praised by the certifiers have turned out to be woefully inadequate when genuinely independent people, which is generally, highly regarded academic computer scientists, actually take a look at the source code. And incidentally, part of the problem is that the source code is private property. These are private companies, and there is no way of examining them in the ordinary course of business. Luckily, these companies aren't terribly well run, and they leave the source code lying around on the internet, so people have managed to pick them up and look at them. But in terms of how the interaction between the parties at the top and local control, one thing that's true in my study of the history of this is that for all the ferociousness surrounding presidential elections, and we're very familiar with that from the last two, I would argue that the most ferocious, most personal, most vicious fighting goes on at the very profoundly local level, and it's always been that way. That's where the stakes are highest for the people involved in the process. If you have a county and it's the county registrar of voters or election superintendent or whatever the title is in the given county, who is friends with one of the candidates, and there's a bit of fight between that candidate and another candidate, the temptation for cheating is huge. And and of the examples I found which have raised my alarm bells as to where there might be cheating, you'd be amazed. It's people running for school board, for water board, where suddenly you see very strange things going on with counts suddenly stopped inexplicably for an hour, and then when they resume, suddenly the positions of these lower order races have mysteriously been transposed. This kind of thing. In terms of appointments to public office, if you look at the old city machines, it was absolutely the parties that ran the election offices. Once a machine took hold in a city like, say, Chicago, which was run by the Republicans in the 20s and then by the Democrats from the 30s onwards, you see that, the election office is the first place where they put in their point men. Not usually particularly prominent, high-profile point men. In fact, there's a whole notoriety that election officials tend to be rather mediocre. Again, Joseph Harris, the political scientist I mentioned earlier, in his study in 1930, denounced election offices as being basically a repository for people who can't make it anywhere else in politics. And again, we're living with that legacy today, although there are some outstanding people running elections as well. I don't want to denigrate them wholesale. There is a relationship between the parties and the people they put into place. And various states have really grappled with this issue. They say, well, if we're not going to have partisans with party labels running election offices, maybe we should make the office a non-partisan. But then the question is, who's appointing the non-partisan official? There are all kinds of shades of grey. And the problem with the system as it now stands, being so polarized between the two parties, is that there is almost no such thing as an objective non-partisan entity or person, whether you're talking about someone to run the election office, whether you're talking about a commission to decide how to carve up congressional districts, which is a big topic now because gerrymandering of districts and eliminating competition in congressional and state legislative races is a huge question in a lot of states. There's no good way to do it because either no one is truly independent or no one is trusted to be truly independent, and that's one of the insidious side effects of the two-party system.
Talk about some examples of elections being thrown. For instance, I know in your book I was surprised to see one with San Francisco and the Jim Jones cult.
Well, this is something that people have forgotten, and they've forgotten it largely because of the tragedies that followed after this. But in 1975, San Francisco was undergoing a political change. Basically, a new Democratic Party machine was taking over from what had been relatively conservative leadership in the city. And the thing that people have forgotten is that essentially the foot soldiers of that machine were Jim Jones's People's Temple. Jim Jones held office in San Francisco. He was the Housing Authority Commissioner. He was on the Human Rights Commission, held one or two other posts. And in the mayoral election of 1975 that was won by George Moscone, people from the People's Temple came into San Francisco. They either voted fraudulently in the city because they weren't registered residents of the city, or they bussed other people in to do the same thing. This is a time-honored technique that started in the 19th century called repeat voting, where you basically pretend to be someone else who you know is either not going to show up at the polls, or you can be sure won't show up at the polls because they're actually dead. And you go around pretending to be different people in different precincts. And in the 19th century, they used to do this by also changing people's clothes, changing their facial hair. They'd start out the day with a full beard, and by the end, they'd be clean-shaven, all those kinds of things. Anyway, Jim Jones's People's Temple did this in 1975. George Moscone won the mayoral election. There was a huge outcry, especially from Moscone's Republican opponent, John Barbagelata. But of course, the city attorney's office appointed a Jim Jones point man as the guy who was going to look into questions of fraud in the election, and he concluded that, of course, everything was absolutely fine. There was even a federal investigation that was forced to give up because all the books that contained the registration lists mysteriously vanished. And again, one can surmise that the Democratic Party machine and the Jim Jones people were responsible for that. No one really remembers it because George Moscone was shot dead along with San Francisco's first openly gay supervisor, Harvey Milk, in 1978, right around the time that Jim Jones took his people down to Guyana, to Jonestown, and they all committed mass suicide, which were, two events that were so horrific that it overshadowed everything else, and people have forgotten that Jim Jones was intimately bound up with the political machine. And in fact, Willie Brown, who was then one of the leaders of this Democratic Party machine, went out of his way to praise Jim Jones at every possible turn. And when Willie Brown became mayor of San Francisco in the mid-1990s, his administration was notorious for the poor management of elections and some very dubious practices, which involved, ballot box cover lids found floating in San Francisco Bay, votes that suddenly showed up, after the election, all kinds of irregularities. People being tried and convicted for voting twice in elections. There were a couple of very tightly contested ballot initiatives in the city where all kinds of suspicions rested on the elections office. The state intervened. They ordered an intervention, tried to clean up the act. And it is now finally cleaned up, as far as everybody can tell, but terrible problems. And I think it's very much connected. It's a classic example. You can find examples in the 19th century, and you can find it again in San Francisco in the 20th century and beginning of the 21st, of how, machine politics drives a process that is interested in election results. It's not interested in the fairness of the process.
Talk about Boss Tweed. That's a name that I would often hear of, but never know really where that came from.
Right. Well, Boss Tweed ran, the machine, Tammany Hall machine in New York City, most notably in the 1860s. And big city machine politics is a fascinating subject because the reputation is that they were hotbeds of corruption. And indeed, Boss Tweed was colossally corrupt, and especially after he established not quite a stranglehold, but a fairly strong foothold on power in New York City. There was tremendous competition among different factions for that, but he came out on top. And once he was on top, he and his cronies started stealing money right, left, and center, just astonishing degrees of theft, especially connected with public works, the most notorious building being the New York County Courthouse, which cost, what in today's money would be hundreds of millions of dollars. Boss Tweed did all kinds of intriguing things like buying a quarry somewhere in New England so that the stone would be used to build the courthouse, and of course he massively overcharged for it, and all the money went straight into his pocket, etc., etc., etc. That's not in doubt. The interesting thing is that when the time came to crack down on Boss Tweed and clean up New York City, everybody was saying, big city corruption is utterly unacceptable, and one of the driving forces behind it is the participation of immigrants, lower class workers who are ignorant or illiterate or semi-illiterate in the voting process, and we have to get them out because they're responsible for causing all this corruption. And what happened when Boss Tweed finally had his downfall and he was arrested, he escaped to Europe, but then he came back and was put back on trial and died in prison, was that all the things that should have been reformed, which is to say the corruption of big cities, the nature of machine politics, really was perpetuated. Boss Tweed wasn't there anymore, but the big city machines in New York, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Kansas City, you name it, it perpetuated and grew actually into the 20th century. And the one thing that was really worth preserving about the system was this intimate relationship between ordinary people, their ward bosses and the wider political system and their profound participation in the voting process, that was demolished. And that was part of the thing that I was talking about earlier with the deliberate disenfranchisement of the bottom half of the electorate. It was the big city machines where that first happened, and it was done under the guise of progressive reform. That is the thing that's really quite mind-boggling when you read the history, is that, you know, what's up actually turns out to be down, and what was down actually turns out to be up.
Do you think a lot of the changes like that occur at the city level and then are imported upwards?
Well, in terms of importing things upwards, you know, the presidential election is a very special case for a lot of reasons. And there have been all kinds of instances of shenanigans in presidential elections, you know, don't get me wrong. Certainly, you know, long before Bush versus Gore. You know, if you think back on Watergate, for example, you know, everybody remembers it now as a scandal about the abuse of executive power. But what it was at its heart was an attempt to steal the presidential election. It turns out that Nixon didn't have any trouble getting re-elected, but that was in part because he had deliberately and in many ways, using dirty tricks, eliminated his most dangerous opponents. And the break-in at Watergate was about getting dirt on the Democrats to find out who they were going to run, you know, what the tactics were and all those kinds of things. Possibly other things too, but there was certainly a strong electoral element there. You know, going back 100 years, the 1880s, there was a famous scandal where the Republican Party was caught with its pants down, handing out money to bribe voters in Indiana. You know, that has happened over and over again at the presidential level. And at the congressional level as well, there have been any number of dirty congressional elections. One recent example that I'm rather fond of, I'm sorry, this was a state legislative election, but the same principle applies in California, where the Republican candidate was worried about his Democratic challenger, and so he and his colleagues came up with a bogus Democratic extra candidate to try and split the Democratic vote. And it came to light because he was caught, and actually there was a big trial, and various people were convicted of fairly serious crimes. So these kinds of games have been played out at every level. You know, my argument about what happens locally is I think that's where you get the most intensive practice of fraudulent election games playing. All kinds of things that have happened over history. You know, there's repeat voting, which I talked about earlier. Bringing people in from out of town in New York City in the 1850s, those people were referred to as pipe layers because they were under instruction. If anybody asked them what they were doing, we're in town to lay a few pipes. Accompanying people into the voting booth, that's known as four-legged voting. Voting in the names of the dead, getting people drunk and persuading them either to stay away so you can use their names, or persuading them to go around from precinct to precinct. You know, any number of techniques that have been, you know, one thing I write in the book is that, you know, the United States was really the place where the first experiments in representative democracy took place, which is all laudable, but it was also a world-class laboratory in vote-stealing techniques, and the two kind of went hand in hand, which makes it fascinating to sort of go through and see how one progressed along with the other.
Talk about the particular election that I think most people will be familiar with to a degree, and that has really got people still talking, which is the 2000 elections. What is your interpretation of what happened there, and what are the really critical points that people should be focusing on?
I think that people identified the wrong core problem of what happened in 2000. The lawyers at the time, the political parties at the time, and a lot of the media blamed it all on the voting machines. And certainly the voting machines were extremely unsatisfactory, you know, lost way too many votes. In certain counties it was as many as 12 or 13% of the vote was lost by the punch card machines. But that, to me, wasn't really what was going on. At the same time as the Florida fight between Al Gore and George Bush, there was another very, very close, too close to call election going on in Washington State right here for the Senate between Slade Gorton, who was the incumbent Republican senator, and Maria Cantwell, his Democratic challenger. They had the same lousy machines here. Perhaps they were slightly better taken care of than they were in Florida. The same question marks over who had really won. But what those two people did was they came to an agreement about respecting the procedures for recounts, first by machine and then by hand. And they just sat back and waited until the process had played itself out fully. And people made fun of Washington State. Gail Collins, an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, joked that in Washington State they like to age their ballots in oak casks. But the fact of the matter was 3.5 weeks went by. Maria Cantwell came out narrowly ahead. They shook hands and she became the next senator from Washington State. In Florida it was very different. And the reason it was very different was because it was a political fight more than anything else. You know, you can accept the shortcomings of the machines and work around them if you want, but that's not what they wanted. The Republicans found themselves in the happy position of being narrowly ahead in the official count. They also found themselves in the happy position of basically being in charge of the state apparatus and made it almost impossible for the Democrats to get a fair hearing when it came to trying to get votes counted. And they clung on to that lead for all it was worth. The Democrats, meanwhile, their best claim for the moral high ground would have been to say right from the start, we need to recount all the votes. We need to have a statewide manual recount. And as it turned out, when the votes were later examined by a couple of media consortia, had they done so, it seems that that Al Gore would have come out narrowly ahead. Too narrowly to be able to say that he was definitively the winner on that basis, but enough technically to get him in the lead. So, he was really kind of strung up by his own strategy, which was to focus only on 4 urban southern Florida counties where he and his handlers believed the biggest trove of hidden votes for him were to be found. And it turned out he was probably wrong about that, which is one of the weird accidents of history. But when you look at Florida, there are many more things going on than the physical vote count and the punch card machines and other problems. For instance, the notorious design of the butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County that probably caused as many as 19,000 votes to be thrown out. Most of them would have probably gone for Gore, which in and of itself would have won in the election. People double voted. Some people voted for Pat Buchanan instead of Al Gore, and including a lot of elderly retired Jews who are absolutely appalled because of Pat Buchanan's views on Israel. All of those things were huge problems. But I think the actual bigger problem was the fact that the Republicans ran a very partisan operation in the state. The Secretary of State who was in charge of voting, Catherine Harris, was also the co-chair of George Bush's election campaign, which, by any standards is an unacceptable conflict of interest. They had no provision for provisional voting. In other words, if you showed up at the polls and your name was not on the list, you couldn't vote first and then have your eligibility checked later. You were simply turned away. And they had drawn up a list of people that they said were ineligible to vote on the grounds that they had a criminal record. This was a job that was outsourced to a private company. And those counties that checked the list, and many of them didn't, found out that somewhere around 95% of the names on the list were there erroneously and should never have been there in the first place. And given that the overwhelming majority of the names on the list were African Americans, and given that 90% of African Americans in Florida voted for Al Gore, one can reasonably estimate, even allowing for very low turnout rates, and the uncertainty surrounding exactly how many people we're talking about, we can estimate that Al Gore's loss of votes from that alone was, at least 10,000 and possibly as much as 30 or 40,000. And for that reason, I believe that Al Gore was the rightful winner of the Florida election, and it was taken away from him. But it wasn't taken away after the election. I think it was more taken away before, and by the state apparatus that was in Republican hands.
And were you surprised by the lack of public outcry over that election, regardless of which way the particular citizens thought things should go?
I think the American public was hoodwinked. People said at the time, isn't it great that we live in a time of peace and prosperity and we can handle this kind of thing? Jeff Greenfield, the commentator for CNN, rather wittily described America in 2000 as a hotbed of rest, which I love that phrase. But I think it was completely wrong. And if you look at what the Republicans were up to, they had a long-term strategy to regain power, especially including the White House. And they were absolutely determined to do it, by hook or by crook. And given what has happened since George Bush came into power and the scale of the ambition of his program, even before 9/11, even before the war on terror was started and all the rest of it, they came in, they wanted to wage war in Iraq. We know that now because they had the position papers all ready to go. They wanted to dismantle Social Security, wanted to basically dismantle the whole of FDR's New Deal. This is not the behavior of a party that thinks of itself as being in a prosperous country in a time of peace that wants to make a few minor adjustments. This is a program for a conservative revolution, and they concealed that. They concealed it from the voters. They even concealed it from their own voters, I would argue. And they certainly concealed it successfully from the media. And even today, the media is very reluctant to admit the scale of what has really gone on in the last few years and the dubious nature of the democratic accountability on which it was based, which is to say, the doubts over the 2000 election. There's a tremendous tendency, if you look at official reporting, they will say George Bush won Florida by 527 votes. They don't even say the official tally was. I don't think anybody in their right mind would believe that George Bush really won Florida by 527 votes, even people who believe that George Bush won the election. That figure is really a random figure, which was where the voting stopped, when the Supreme Court pulled the plug. And again, the behavior of the Supreme Court was extremely troubling. I've never met a lawyer who thought that the argument put forward by the Supreme Court for stopping the election was anything other than the most dodgy legal argument, and that the real thing that they wanted to achieve was getting a Republican into the White House. And even more worrying than that to me was the arguments put forward by Judge Antonin Scalia, who cited, technically, from a technical point of view correctly, the fact that according to Article 2 of the Constitution, there is no right to vote in presidential elections. He's right about that technically. It's up to state legislatures to decide, according to the Constitution, how their slate of electors is going to be drawn up. But in terms of democratic and political tradition in this country, no Supreme Court justice had dared say anything of that kind for 100 years. There was an unquestioned tradition of voting rights in this country. And he came out and challenged that in public, in his public statements, and again in the majority ruling, which one presumes he was at least partly responsible for. It was unsigned. And the very idea that you can go back and question the right to vote is a very alarming prospect. And when you now hear about the judicial philosophy that is being promoted by conservatives for the Supreme Court, they call it originalism, which means going back to the letter of the Constitution as it was originally drafted. If that's the way they're going to interpret it, you can make a very powerful argument, or at least raise a very powerful red flag that says it doesn't seem like they're actually interested in perpetuating American democracy, and that's something that really needs to be watched very closely.
And then coming out of that election, there was then a program for, at least on the surface, what appeared to be fixing in terms of making things correct, our electoral process. Can you talk about that?
Right. Well, as I say, I think that the analysis of the problem was wrong. It wasn't the voting machines. It was the whole process that needed re-examination. But everybody focused on the machines. And even the focus on the machines was subject to political manipulation almost immediately. Florida, within a month of the election, had convened a blue ribbon panel to look at the problems and make recommendations. Their key recommendation was to have a uniform voting system throughout the counties of Florida, and one of the reasons they did that is because the Supreme Court's excuse for intervening was, unequal application of voting rights because of different voting systems. They said, have a uniform system. They looked at the different systems and said the one that seems to us as the most promising is having precinct-based paper ballots that are filled in, you fill in the little bubbles like you do the SAT test, and then have those electronically scanned. And, other experts would have suggested and supplement that by having a random manual recount as well to make sure the tabulation is done correctly by the machines. What did Florida do? The state legislature rejected the idea that they would insist on uniform standards. Various money men came in. Essentially, the company that had supplied Florida with its punch card machines, ES&S, had what was really no more than a prototype for a computer touchscreen machine called an Ivotronic. Through the good offices of the former Secretary of State, Sandra Mortham, who's a Republican, who also happened to be the chief lobbyist for the Federation of Florida Counties, so she was effectively selling these things to herself. She persuaded Miami-Dade, Broward, and one or two other counties to buy these untested systems. When they were first put to the test in the primaries for the governor's election in 2002, they melted down catastrophically. Jeb Bush had to declare a state of emergency. They didn't boot up basically in time. Then there was a power failure. Votes were lost. The whole thing was a complete disaster. And they spent tens of millions of dollars first buying these systems, and then after they went wrong and they realized that they had to boot them up the night before because it took so long to get them to boot up, they then had to spend more millions of dollars on getting the police to stand guard outside polling stations so that nobody could tamper with the machines overnight before the polling officially began. The whole thing was just a complete mess. And this pattern extraordinarily replicated itself all around the country. Everybody looked at the computer voting machines, said, miracle solution, computers, it's got to work. Nobody examined the software to make sure that it really was effective. Nobody asked hard questions about who these companies were, how new this technology was, how much it had been tested, how long it was likely to last before it would have to be replaced, what standards it was made to. As it turns out, that the standards that all these machines and the software adhered to were 1990 standards, which is basically the Stone Age in digital terms. New standards came in 2002, but through various loopholes, they still are not being adhered to. It's still the 1990 standards that apply across much of the country because of grandfather provisions and pedantic semantic definitions of what's a system versus what's a component, all kinds of ways in which they've avoided actually upgrading their systems. And And a lot of voting rights activists became deeply suspicious that there was something going on over and above simply selling machinery. And, you hear a lot of very concerned talk that because the voting machine companies, ES&S, which I mentioned, Diebold, which is the one that gets the most press, and Sequoia, which is the third of the big three, very deep concern that the boards of these companies are people who contribute to the Republican Party. What does this mean in terms of their management of their own machinery? Are people, rigging these machines to make sure Republicans win and Democrats never do? I think these are all very legitimate concerns. I think it's slightly barking up the wrong tree for a couple of reasons. The first basic principle reason why I think it's barking up the wrong tree is because the important thing with these machines is not to ask what is the political affiliation of the people who make them. It's to ask, are they accountable? Are they verifiable? If they were verifiable, it wouldn't matter who owned them. And that's the key point that needs to be focused on. Point number one. Point number two, a lot of the jurisdictions that bought these machines were run by Democrats. The first state to go all touchscreen was Georgia, run by Democrats. The second state to go all touchscreen was Maryland, run by Democrats. Diebold has now actually very recently hired the former chair of the Democratic National Committee, Joe Andrew, to head up their PR offensive to try and convince everybody that these machines aren't quite as lousy as everybody thinks they are. Again, I can believe that these voting officials were hoodwinked technologically into thinking that they were buying something that was of value. I don't believe for an instant that they were hoodwinked politically into buying machines that would act as a kind of Trojan horse that would demolish their own party. I just don't buy that for a second. But one of the things that's extraordinary, as I say, is that there was no communication from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, or very little. So everybody fell into the same trap. County officials were awash with money because the federal government, through the Help America Vote Act, was promising billions to buy new systems. State legislatures were passing, approving, the release of millions of dollars of funds as well. And from the point of view of the county official, they thought, the punch cards are an embarrassment, not because they don't produce fair elections, but because they embarrass us. They make us look bad. They make us do work, because when you recount these things, you realize that there's problems with the CHAD, there's problems with the maintenance of these machines, all these things. The beauty of these computers is that everything is hidden. There's no paper. No one can ever second guess us or say we didn't manage it right. I think that's the key point. It's not that it's a political conspiracy. It's a bureaucratic conspiracy, if you want to call it that. That, as an election lawyer in Florida once explained it to me, you're a journalist. You don't like rewriting your stories when your editors tell you to. It's the same with voting officials. They want to have a nice, clean process where they can tie everything up with a nice, neat ribbon and present it to the voters and their bosses on county boards of supervisors and say, look, everything was great. So for them, not having the provision for having recounts on the new electronic machines is a big plus. And the fact that it's a complete betrayal of the public interest, and also, incidentally, a complete travesty of every basic rule of international election practice, because having the possibility of a recount is absolutely essential to guarantee the integrity of the vote. This is something that doesn't seem to occur to them as being even a problem, and it's only because of the pushing and screaming of ordinary activists in many cases that this issue has even come to the fore. And we've seen now in the last year or two big pushes for having mandatory independent audit trails on these machines. My own personal take, incidentally, on the audit trails is that from a symbolic point of view, they're very important because it's a way of saying, we're not prepared to have machines without an independent backup. I think they're actually pretty unsatisfactory for a couple of reasons. One is because most voters don't tend to check the independent piece of paper as they vote, so their value is dubious. And secondly, because the machines have much bigger problems, in terms of the quality of the software, in terms of the longevity of the software. This is basically bleeding edge technology that's being rushed into service without any kind of, beta testing or anything to make sure it's going to have the desired performance standards. I would advocate, because they're too expensive, because they're too unreliable, and because they're uniquely prone to hacking on a massive scale. If you get into one of the tabulation machines for one of these companies, you can affect the results not just in your local jurisdiction, but everywhere in the country where these machines are used. So we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of counties where results can be changed with a few keystrokes in a way that is completely undetectable if anybody goes back and checks afterwards, if it's done right. So, I think the thing you should do is just toss these machines out altogether and go with cheaper ones. I think the optical scan machines that were recommended by the Florida Commission are probably the best bet in many jurisdictions. Obviously you can work on other technologies, and I think the way to work on other technologies, rather than entrusting it to private companies that won't even show their work to anybody, and in fact, under the rules of proprietary ownership, in many cases it's illegal to examine, you should have a public agency that sets about putting real money into having an open source system that everybody can check, look at, and decide whether or not it's going to work. That seems to be a very valuable thing to do. When people go around and say, but it's so difficult, voting is so fiddly, elections are so complicated. My counter argument is, what about internet poker? Here you have a system where you have thousands, tens of thousands of people playing a very intricate game. Money is changing hands right, left, and center. The whole thing is totally secure. The reputation of these companies absolutely depends on these machines working and working right, and people getting paid the money they're supposed to be paid, and nobody's identity being compromised, nobody's credit card details being leaked, and they managed to do it. And when I put this to an academic expert who actually rather likes the idea of computer voting machines, he said, oh, well, they just have money that the public sector is never going to have. To which my response is, well, that's true, but does it have to be that way? Instead of spending these tens of millions, if not ultimately billions of dollars, buying up these, I think, overpriced, underperforming systems on a county-by-county basis, why don't you pool that money and develop an internet poker style voting machine system that everybody can be satisfied is going to work up to those same standards? There's no reason why it couldn't be done. It's an institutional failure. There's no proper federal oversight of elections. There's no strong institutional backing for it. The Help America Vote Act does have a provision for setting up a federal oversight body called the Election Assistance Commission. They've been underfunded from the start. They're now in this very unhappy position of trying to draw up standards for voting machines that have essentially been developed and are now in service. Try having that job and see if you like it. And it's very hard to be optimistic about the future, because certainly for the next couple of election cycles, these machines are going to continue to be used with paper trails or without. And I don't think anybody can trust how well they're going to work from a mechanical point of view, and no one can necessarily trust they're not going to be tampered with.
And again, it sounds like the big point of resistance beyond those machines is the two parties that are being well serviced by the current system that we have.
I don't know if they are. I mean, the interesting thing is, of course, now we're in a phase of American history where Republicans have tended to win elections for the last few cycles. There is quite a lot of movement on the Democratic side for saying, we need to do something about these machines so that if we lose, we know we've lost because we lost rather than because the election was stolen. But there's a tremendous degree of institutional resistance, as you point out. The parties don't like talking about it. I don't think elected officials in general like to dwell too much on the manner by which they came to their elected office, because it raises all kinds of very uncomfortable questions, not only about voting machinery, but also about the nature of campaign financing, all these very tricky issues. And, what I identify in the book is, broader corruptions of the American democratic system. I think, having two parties that are fundamentally financed by corporate interests and having election campaigns that are based primarily on media advertising rather than unpaid public debate on the issues is not at all in the public interest. And if you wonder why people don't show up to vote, it's because, districts have been gerrymandered so there's no real competition, so there's no incentive. It's because the quality of debate, it's no debate at all. It's just shouting on television through negative advertising. If there are issues that are of interest to individual voter groups, they don't necessarily ever find out about it. The whole thing is basically a machine for disengaging and alienating voters rather than engaging them and bringing them into the process. And elected officials don't like to think about that because they speak the civic religion of American democracy. They like to believe that the system works, and to start raising too many questions threatens everything that they've achieved to get to where they are. And I think that is the real resistance. It's not that it serves the two parties necessarily, but it's just too painful and too difficult to look at in the current context.
Do you have a sense from the work that you've done, the number or percentage of elections where the people are actually getting a fair shot at things?
I think probably most elections, actually, which may come as a surprise given the title of my book. But the point is, most elections aren't critical elections. It's where it's critical, where the stakes are very high, and where one party has sufficient control of the apparatus to have the means to fiddle with things. That's where the problem lies. And it's no coincidence, if you look at the last few years, that the biggest fights have been over very close elections. I think it's pretty hard if you know that the stakes are high and there's a risk that your side is going to lose. It's pretty hard to come out with a 80% to 20% result with a straight face. So what it is, it's fighting in those margins. And that's where the problems arise. Most elections aren't close elections, and there's no real motive for anybody to fiddle with the system. It goes ahead, the machines work imperfectly, but the result is broadly correct, and the administrators broadly do their job as they're supposed to. It's, as I say, it's when the stakes are high and the opportunity is there for mischief, that's where you've got to look, and that's where the problems arise again and again and again.
How does the U.S. rate against other democratic countries? It's interesting that, of course, we consider ourselves the select country for exporting democracy by force into other countries. If you look at, like, let's say, Iraq.
Right. Well, I mean, as I said earlier, there are a number of things that make the American system, anomalous, and the fact that there is so much foul play at election time is something that really doesn't apply to any other country on that kind of scale. Of course, there are instances of cheating here and there, but fundamentally Western Europe cleaned up its electoral act sometime in the late 19th century. But for reasons I explained earlier, that was right at the time when America was busy disenfranchising people. And in the South, of course, the introduction of completely shocking laws that disenfranchise black voters and strip them of their civil rights and encourage lynching and all those other things, which are a very dark thing in American history. The fascinating thing about America as an exporter of the idea of democracy is that it's always been clouded by unsatisfactory overtones. In the 1950s, when the South still had its Jim Crow laws and disenfranchised almost all black voters, it was considered a real problem in Washington. Richard Nixon actually was one of the people who said, this is untenable. We're in a propaganda war with the Soviet Union, and it's too easy for them to point to the South and say, how can they preach the language of democracy when they deny it to a whole swath of their own population? And that, I think, was one of the big spurs in official Washington to enact civil rights legislation and change that. We're in a similar situation now, where, as you say, we're talking about exporting democracy to Iraq and possibly elsewhere. And it's obvious to everybody who reads the newspapers, who's looked at Florida in 2000, who's looked at 2004, who reads about voting machines or whatever, that America does not practice what it preaches. And this is actually causing huge problems internationally. The main institution that has been responsible for overseeing the passage to democracy of the former Soviet Union countries, other countries in developing parts of the world, is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which, despite its title, includes the United States. It did sterling work for 10, 12, 15 years in bringing countries like Albania, the Czech Republic, Armenia, and others into the fold of democratic practices. They did brilliant election observation missions. Suddenly you get a situation where they're going to places like Ukraine and Georgia and finding huge problems. And those countries and allied countries, notably Russia and Belarus, are suddenly saying, why are you coming to our countries and criticizing our elections? It's a total double standard because you don't go to the United States and criticize them. And what has happened is that the machinery of the OSCE and its mission to try and encourage democracy around the world has ground to a halt because Russia is threatening to withdraw funding, it's refusing to cooperate, putting all kinds of pressures on diplomats and foreign governments. And interestingly, in 2004, the OSCE tried to remedy this by sending a mission to the United States, but it ran into all kinds of obstacles, not the least of which is the fact that American counties and states have no provision for allowing international observers in. A few counties are willing to do it, but most aren't. And there was no mechanism by which they could actually get in and verify what was going on. Jimmy Carter has pointed to the same thing. His Carter Center, of course, has gone all around the world monitoring elections and certifying whether or not the results were fair. He was asked on the eve of the 2004 election whether he would ever consider sending a mission to his own country, to the United States. And he said he couldn't even do it because the basic conditions were not fulfilled. He says, we don't go to countries that don't have a central electoral commission. We don't go to countries that have machines without the possibility of recounts. We don't go to countries that don't have equal unpaid access to the media for all candidates, not just the major party candidates. The United States doesn't meet our basic criteria. Venezuela does, but not the United States.
So what do you see as solutions to our problems here in the U.S.?
Well, there are small steps that can be taken. The bigger problem, I think, is the political culture and the two-party system. I have no easy answers how you're going to change that. But small steps can be taken. You can streamline procedures. For instance, the commission set up by Jimmy Carter and James Baker said, it's very good we now have provisional balloting, but what we need to do is streamline the rules so it's the same everywhere. So it's absolutely clear, can somebody go to a precinct other than the one where they're supposed to vote and still be allowed to vote by provisional ballot? All these troubling questions that were subject to political manipulation in the 2004 election cycle need to be straightened out. Ditto with registration procedures. Ditto, incidentally, they recommended strongly that international and domestic election observers should be allowed in as a matter of course. These kinds of things are realistic, and especially if you've got somebody like James Baker who has the ear of the White House signing off on these things, there is a possibility that they will come to pass. You can also certainly have a clamour for more transparent, better voting machines. The fact that we now have legislation in roughly half the states for an independent paper trail on computer voting machines is very heartening. As I said earlier, I don't think it's enough, but it's a sign that the legislative wheels can be turned when the pressure's on. The other thing you can have, I would like to see more of, is experiments in different forms of voting. In San Francisco and in other places, they are now experimenting with instant runoff voting, which is a way of allowing, instead of having a second round, which inevitably has very depressed turnout and historically has always benefited the two parties, you can have the first and the second and subsequent rounds of election all wrapped into one. And it works in San Francisco because they have non-partisan elections for mayor there. It's likely to run into resistance with the Democrats and the Republicans because one of the attractions of the system, which is from the point of view of the two big parties, one of the drawbacks, is that it might allow third-party candidates to do rather well. But if it starts slowly in different jurisdictions and it proves popular, then you can start, very slowly developing momentum for it. Another area which badly needs examination, and I think you might be able to get support for it on a localized basis, is public financing of campaigns. They do that in Arizona. They do that in certain other states. At the point at which politicians find it intolerable to spend so much of their time fundraising, and at the point at which the Democratic Party in particular finds it's not winning elections because it's so beholden to the same corporate interests as the Republicans and no one takes them seriously as a party, you might begin to see momentum building to have more public financing and get rid of the corporate money and to have more candidates' debates. The problem with the debates, of course, is it's not only the candidates that have to participate, the media has to participate too, and it's such a cash cow for the media to have the advertising dollars from political campaigns. They have no motivation to put forums on the television. They want the negative advertising. They love it. It's good entertainment, it's good advertising revenue, and that's a very insidious part of the system that needs to change too. But as I say, baby steps, and the underlying thing has to be pressure from grassroots activists on both sides of the aisle. There isn't nearly enough of it from the Republican side. And I think part of the reason for that is this whole issue's been turned into a partisan issue, which is insane. There's nothing about voting rights that's partisan at all. Everybody should want to have a fair system. And those activists should then hold the feet of politicians to the fire and say, you talk the Democratic talk, now act like you mean it. And that kind of pressure over time, I think, can bear fruit.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for spending time with us today.
It's been a pleasure.
We have just been talking with Andrew Gumbel. He is author of Steal This Vote, Dirty Elections and the Rotten History of Democracy in America.